It's an honor to be with you again, and today I want to get right to it. I want to talk to you about the idea that we were made for something bigger, all of us. And specifically, what's the sentence you're going to live out your life by? Faith. I want to begin with a question. I'd like you to ponder this simple question. I want you to take a moment and reflect on the most important endeavor you've ever been a part of. In other words, at the time you felt it was very important and almost impossible. It could be a competition you were part of, an event, or an opportunity that captured your attention and became your focus. My guess is every one of us have been a part of something we thought, oh my gosh, this is bigger than life. Very important, almost impossible. With that in mind, I want to share with you a simple metaphor, an image that's going to guide me through this simple message to you. I simply call it life sentence. Life sentence. So I want you to imagine life on earth 10 or 12 years after you're gone. Okay? You've died, they've had your funeral, years have passed, you're gone. But people are going to stand around the place where you worked, or the neighborhood where you lived, or the church you went to, and they're going to be talking. And your name is going to come up in the conversation. And somebody's eventually going to say, what did she do? Or what did he do? It may be quiet because it has been 10 or 12 years, but eventually somebody's going to say, oh, I remember, she was the one who, or he was the one that, and they're going to summarize your entire contribution in life with one sentence. Darn it. Yes, you deserve a paragraph. Some of you deserve a chapter of a book. Some of you deserve a whole book. But isn't it true? Even famous people get summarized by a single sentence. Think about history. George Washington, father of our country. That's all he gets, Abraham Lincoln, stopped the Civil War. Harry Truman, dropped the atom bomb. We tend to get remembered in a little soundbite, or shall I say, a tweet. So my big question is, if I'm right about this, if people were watching your life right now, what would they say? Would it be, oh, she was a really fun person, or he had a great 401k, or something like that? Or would it be something more than just stuff that you did on the earth? So here's kind of the truth in a nutshell. The contribution of any person will ultimately be summed up in a single sentence. Although we participate in many activities, we're going to be remembered for one and two. And I'm asking you, what will your sentence be? Now, you probably already figured out as you ponder this, and probably this is not the first time you pondered this thought, but you're kind of living with the end in mind, right? Rather than just day to day to day, just doing survival or doing maintenance and hoping you get to Friday and nobody gets hurt in the family, that sort of thing. You may have figured out that I'm differentiating now, that there might just be a difference between your work and your job. Let me share what I mean by this. Let's compare and contrast for just a minute. Our job is about generating income, right? In fact, in the job interview, you go, how much will I make? That's what you're really concerned about. Our work is about our calling and our ultimate contribution. Could be the same place, but there's a work and there's a job. One's bigger. Our jobs come and go. You might have several jobs during your career, but our work remains the common thread throughout all of your jobs. For instance, for me, I've had 5 significant different jobs in my 45-year career, but every one of them had something to do with the next generation. I was pouring into students. I was working with kids and schools. But the point was, I had a job. It changed, but my calling, my contribution, my work did not change. Finally, number 3, our jobs enable us to be consumers. We can buy refrigerators and cars and homes, but our work enables us to be contributors. And I guess far too often, I think too many people, at least that I know, are just caught up in their job. They're just doing it mundane, day to day to day, rather than thinking about, as I do this job, what will the ultimate contribution be that I make? So very rapidly, let me kind of give you a connection. Then I want to look at a biblical story that's going to illustrate this vividly. I want to talk about the connection now between your job and your work. Think about this. Number 1, our job can be a place to find and do our work. In other words, a boss may, or a supervisor may hand you a job description, and even though he or she is going, I just want you to do this job, you realize, while I do this job, there may be something even bigger to do. Which leads me to number 2. Our work is almost always bigger than our job. I remember figuring this out in my very first career job. I thought those 7 things they put on that piece of paper for me to do as a job description were nowhere near the bigger thing I felt I was called to do while using that job. And then lastly, number 3, I believe our paycheck is seldom an accurate reflection of our true kingdom value. When I look at nurses or teachers, for instance, I think, oh my gosh, you ought to be getting paid what the athletes are getting paid, and maybe the athletes ought to be getting what you're paid right now. When I think about the value of those service jobs, moms, stay-at-home moms, you guys deserve a huge paycheck in my book. But I want you to catch where I'm going. There's a job, for sure. Do the job. In fact, don't think about your work until you've got that job done. But you ought to be thinking, that piece of paper I've been given to do by a human being is only the beginning of what I may be called to do. So as I promised, I want to look at a case study today. In the next several minutes, I want to look at a single story recorded 2,600 years ago, true story of a young lady who figured this out, who learned this huge lesson. In fact, she got a sentence. And hopefully using this great illustration, you'll be able to apply it to your own life and see maybe I need to tweak my life right now for the future. So this story I want to share with you is found in the book of Esther. Esther is a very short book in the Old Testament, if you want to read it again, but you probably didn't read it recently. It's not one of those famous books like the Psalms or whatever. But this single book is about a young lady named Esther. The name God doesn't even show up, but he's all through the pages of this book. So let me introduce you to the 3 main characters that are in this story, and then I'm going to read a passage that I hope it comes alive for you for the first time maybe in this talk. So the first main character is Esther herself. So Esther was a Hebrew. She was a Jewish girl who began her life living in Israel, where most of the Jews were. But the Persians came in, overtook Israel, and they began to take hundreds of thousands of Jewish people captive, and they carted them over to Persia. So they went east to Persia. Esther was a young lady, maybe 12, 13 years old at the time. So this young girl goes over. We don't know where her parents were, but the caretaker at the time was her cousin. I'll talk about him in a minute. But Esther is this lovely young girl who grows up now in this strange land as a migrant, I guess. And she's trying to figure out a new culture, a new group of people, and she's in a very, very, very strange land compared to the first decade of her life. The second main character is Mordecai. Mordecai was this cousin of Esther's, but he was much, much older. And so he really served more like an uncle and a mentor to Esther. So he was guiding her in her young days. And it became very significant because while Esther was about 14 years old, the king of Persia decides to fire his queen. Yes, he did that. So I guess they did that back in the days. So he ousts the queen, and he decides to choose a new queen by lining up all the young ladies in the kingdom that he felt were beautiful, and in a way, sort of like American Idol or America's Got Talent or whatever, lines them all up, and he picks a winner. Well, this king of Persia picks Esther to be the queen. Now remember, she's 14, so she's the equivalent of a freshman in high school. Think about that. Not fully mature, but very lovely looking. The king likes her. He picks her, and now she's thrust into this job of Queen of Persia. Now, I'm getting excited because notice I just used the word job. She could have taken that job and thought, oh my, OMG, this is my work. I'll be remembered for being the Queen of Persia. Mordecai later teaches her, oh, no, Esther. This role you just got as queen is only a platform. It's only a job to do your greater work. Here's why I say that. The third big character in this story is a guy by the name of Haman. Haman was a man who absolutely hated the Hebrew race. He hated the Jews. In fact, he comes up with a plot to commit genocide against the Jews. In fact, here's how I would describe it. If Esther was the Princess Diana of her day, this beautiful lady that marries into the royal family and comes into a place of influence, Haman would have been the Adolf Hitler of his day. He hated the Jews, and when he comes into this place of power, he decides, let's wipe them all out. I don't know why he hated them, but he hated them. Well, get this. When Mordecai hears of Haman's plot, both Mordecai and Esther are both Jewish people. Mordecai sends word through a servant to Esther in the palace and says, Esther, honey, you got to do something. Haman wants to take us all out. Well, if I can paraphrase, Esther's first response back was, nah, I think I'm fine. Love the palace. I'm doing great. It's okay. I don't think I'm going to do anything. So Mordecai sends a second word back, and he says, Esther, you don't understand. You're Jewish too. If the Jews all die, you're going to die with us. And in fact, you've got to do something. When Mordecai sends that word to Esther, she comes back with this reply. Mordecai, you don't understand. If I walk into the king's throne room without an invitation, I could be executed. And it's true, there was an edict at the time that if anybody, including the queen, walked into the king's throne room without an invitation, it could end their life. So she's got a legitimate concern, don't you think? Okay, walk in the wrong room, it's the end of my life. But Mordecai comes back a third time with a closing argument, trying to convince her, you've got to do something about this grave situation we find ourselves in. And when he makes his final response, Esther says, you're right, I've got to do this. In fact, she says to him, I've got to do this, and if I perish, I perish. But I want to show you now two verses of Scripture that are what Mordecai said back to Esther, that I believe, like I use this term, these verses are pregnant with meaning for us today. There's lessons in them. Here they are. This is Esther chapter 4, verses 13 and 14. And let's just follow with me as I read it to you. Mordecai sent back this answer. This was the third response he gives her. And I quote, do not think because you're in the king's palace, you can escape any more than all the rest of the Jews. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And then Mordecai says the most famous words in the entire book of Esther. Listen to these words. He says, and yet, who knows? And yet, who knows? But that you've come to a royal position for such a time as this. I'm sure you've heard that verse before. Can I paraphrase what he's really saying? Esther, who knows but what you got this job for a far greater work to be done. And by the way, I'm just going to jump to the end of the story right now before we teach any lessons. Esther walks in, brings this up, talks to the king about Haman's plot. He not only listens to Esther, he takes Haman's life because of this plot. And Esther ends up saving the Jewish race, keeps the Jewish line alive for Christ to come and save us all. Not a bad work, wouldn't you agree? And by the way, I just want you to know, she's the wrong age, she's young, she's the wrong gender, it's a woman, but she does this incredible thing. So I just want you to hear me. I know you may be cruising along just fine. You're paying the bills, you're raising the kids, minimal distractions. But I'm telling you, every one of you could be in a place of complacency right now where all is fine, but we're not really doing the work we've been called to do. So in the remaining minutes I have, I want to share what I believe are 4 incredible lessons that we learn from these simple words that Mordecai shared with Esther. They were for a 14-year-old girl back in the day. They're for you and I today. So each of these lessons, if you're taking notes or if you're making mental notes, I'm going to give you 4 statements, and all of them begin with a phrase, if I don't step out and obey, ... All right? So here they are. This is Esther 4, 13 and 14. Lesson number 1. If I don't step out and obey, my fate will not differ from the rest of the crowd. Did you notice the first thing Mordecai said? He said, do not think that you in the king's palace can escape any more than all the rest of the Jews. He's basically saying, Esther, don't think that you're safe here because you're in a palace. By the way, I just want to stop and say, this happens to me all the time. And maybe it happens to you as well. We know that we're Christians. We know that we're saved. We know that we're going to heaven or whatever. And we start thinking, I can just sit around. I'll just binge on Netflix or whatever. Nothing criminal about that. But just sitting around, we can't expect our fate to be any different than the rest of the crowd. Yes, your eternity's different. That's good. But I mean life on earth. Listen to me. History is full of examples where the people of God were quiet and did nothing, and we went into very dark times. In fact, if you go back and study the Dark Ages, do you know what really brought that on, at least in my opinion? Well, it was a number of things, but one of the big things was God's people kind of hunkered down in a monastery somewhere. I mean, the true saints, the true believers were kind of just, they were there praying for sure, that was good, but they weren't out mixing it up with the world, being salt and light and affecting the world. So we can't think today, in this year we're living in, way far away from Esther's time, that we can just sit around and just kind of attend church, sit in a seat, shake the pastor's hand and go home. It's not good enough. If we don't step out and take that risk that he may be calling us to take, we cannot expect our fate to be different than the rest of the crowd. I think we develop a safety myth that is very, very dangerous. The second big lesson I want to give you is this one. If I don't step out and obey, God will bless someone else who will. Now, did you notice the next thing that Mordecai says to Esther? He says, if you remain silent at this time, relief for the Jews will arise from another place. In other words, basically, here's what Mordecai is saying to Esther. Don't be deceived, Esther. God's purposes are not going to be thwarted. He's going to win this thing in the end. He'll use you, he'll use someone else, but he's going to get this job done. And I feel like I need to hear this maybe once a week in my own life. If I don't step out and obey, God's going to find someone, maybe less appropriate for the calling that he's got, but they're willing to get up off their bottom and do something about it. I think we're here today. We may vote in November, or we may do this or that, or give a little charitable gift to Salvation Army or whatever. That's all fine and well. I don't want to put that down. I'm just saying, I think the real need of the hour is for the people of God to get up and take a risk where there's no guarantee, there's no insurance policy, there's no safety device. It's risking out of obedience. See, we love safety and insurance and guarantees. And God would say, I'm sorry, here's the guarantee. I'm with you. That's his guarantee. I'm with you. Now go out and do this. And Esther didn't know that her life might not be taken. By the way, another thing about history. I believe history is marked by the people of God who were very, very talented and gifted and maybe even called to do a certain thing that didn't do it. And God used a very untalented, ungifted, perhaps inappropriate person to get his job done. My favorite evangelist in the 19th century, you may have heard of him, maybe not, was a guy named Dwight Moody. There's a Moody Bible Institute in Chicago right now. Dwight Moody was an evangelist in the 19th century, perhaps the greatest. But did you know Moody was a preacher who was an evangelist whose grammar was horrible? Moody, when he would speak, it was just awful. In fact, when he would speak at universities, professors would hold their hands over their ears, not because he didn't like the message. The grammar was just so bad. In fact, funny story. One time he's in front of a lot of faculty members at a university, and Moody's just talking, and he's just messing up all the sentences right and left. And so one of the professors gets a piece of paper and writes down the word fool. And he hands it to an usher and says, walk this up to Dwight Moody. True story. The usher runs it up to Dwight Moody. Moody reads the note, fool. And Dwight Moody said this, this is funny. Several times I've had people write me a note and forget to sign it. This is the first time somebody signed their note and forgot to write the note. I thought that was awesome. My favorite sermon title that Dwight Moody ever preached, here it is. Don't think God don't love you, for he do. That was the sermon title. Now, I'm underscoring this because if Moody were here with us today, he'd say, I didn't have the gifts to do this, but I was willing to get up and go after it. And so God bypasses several other people and says, I'll take Dwight because he's willing to do it. Dwight Moody won 1 million people to Christ. No TV, no websites, no broadcast. He was just willing to go out and go after it. If I don't step out and obey, God will bless someone else who will. Bob Richards is one of my favorite Olympians from the United States. After the second gold medal was hung around Bob Richards' neck for the pole vault event, Here's what he said. He said, and I quote, "There are many men who could be Olympic champions, all Americans who never tried. I'd estimate 5 million people could have beaten me in the pole vault the years that I won it. At least 5 million. Men that are bigger, stronger, and faster than I was could have done it. But they never made the feeble effort to get their legs up over the bar." That's an indictment to those of us that have specific talents and gifts, and we're just letting them sit. So let's look at the third lesson we get from Mordecai, okay? I think he would say to us today, if you don't step out and obey, I may lose more than an opportunity. Did you notice what Mordecai said next to Esther? He said, if you remain silent, relief will arise for the Jews from another place. But then he said, and you and your family, you and your father's family will perish. This is the second time he's kind of bringing up a death threat to Esther. I think she might go, are you manipulating me? But he's just underscoring the gravity of the situation. He's simply saying, if you don't step out and do this, I know it's scary. You may lose more than a chance to make a difference. You may lose your life. So you and I relish the fact, do we not, that we serve a God of second chances. Can I get an amen from the choir on that one, okay? We serve a God of second chance, third chance, fourth. I think I'm not on plan B. I think I'm on plan H right now. I have messed it up several times in my life. And I do it with gusto, by the way. But here's what I think the lesson is. We do serve a God of second chances. Unfortunately, although he gives a second chance, we don't get the first chance again. It's a miss. Let me tell you how and when I learned this, and it was an unforgettable lesson. So years ago, when I was still in college, I put together some multimedia presentations that I could take into the public high schools around the Tulsa area. I put them together so they would fit into courses that were being taught in history, but it would be a biblical viewpoint that would start conversations in the dining hall at lunch. So history teachers would bring me in to talk about where is history taking us. And I would talk about prophecy. And I would talk about how these people, the prophets, were forecasting what would happen in the end times. It was always intriguing, and even though this was a public school, this was an intriguing topic that they seemed to like. So one particular day, I'll never forget, I was standing in front of juniors in high school. So they're 16, 17 years old. And as I'm talking, I notice out of the corner of my eye, there's a young lady, there's a girl in the class who's not paying any attention to my talk. Now, I don't know if you're a speaker or you get up in front very often, but when you can tell someone's not paying attention, you kind of want to, do something to get their attention. So I'm kind of waving my arm, getting very charismatic in my delivery, And Paula was her name, Paula Stringer, just was not interested. She just was looking at the floor, looking at her watch, waiting for this dumb thing to get over. So as I'm talking, I don't know if you do this too, I start praying internally while I'm talking. And my prayer was, God, what do I need to do to get her attention? And it was in that moment, even though this is very, very rare, I felt like the Holy Spirit prompted me. That quiet voice, it's not out loud, but it's just that prompt you get, you go, that was a better thought than I had. The prompt came to me on the inside, and here it was. When you're finished, talk to her. When you're finished, talk to her. And suddenly it made sense. Oh yeah, Paula's not going to be reached in this big crowd, but maybe in a one-to-one conversation after it's over. So I finished my talk. Students clapped. They started filing out of the big room. And here comes Paula walking up toward me and then right past me. In fact, she's walking right past. I could have reached out and touched her shoulder and began a conversation. But did I do that? No. I'm talking to another student who liked my talk, and I felt like I needed to hear what he liked about my talk. And so Paula goes right by. As she's walking by, I sense that prompt on the inside again. And again, I don't want to over-spiritualize this. This doesn't happen every day, but I sense that poking of God's Spirit saying, do it now. Do it now. But I didn't. I rationalized. I said, I've got to talk to this guy. I'll reach her in a little bit. Well, by the time we get done, I rush out into the hallway, and the next period of classes has begun, and I missed my chance to talk to Paula. Well, I rationalized again. I thought, oh, no big deal. I'm up here all the time. I'll see her again. I'm sure I'll see her again. And folks, I I did see Paula again, one last time. But unfortunately, the next time and the final time I saw her was when her photograph appeared on the front page of the local city newspaper. Her body had been found on the banks of the Arkansas River. She was half naked. She had been sexually assaulted and stabbed to death, and Paula was gone. And my heart sunk as I looked at the headlines and saw her picture. Because I thought to myself, no wonder the Spirit of God was prompting me, do it now. Do it now. I think he was saying, I'd like to use you. I'd like to use you. But I rationalized. My biggest prayer, and again, I don't mean to over-spiritualize this, but my biggest prayer was, God, I hope somebody else was more obedient than I was to respond to the prompt to just share the love of God with her if she didn't know you. But my lesson was, if I don't step out and obey, I could lose more than an opportunity. In that case, we lost Paula. All right, one last big lesson I think we learned from Mordecai. If I don't step out and obey, number 4, I could miss my God-given work in life. You see, I think very few of us have a job that we would say, this job is exactly my calling. Most of us say, I've got a job, I can probably do my work that God's called me to do, but it's a platform for something else. I think the last thing that Mordecai says to Esther is absolutely profound. Can I remind you? Here's how he ended his little argument with her. And yet, who knows, he said, but that you've come to this royal position for such a time as this. Who knows but that you got this job to do this greater work that God had in mind from the very beginning. So when I was a sophomore in college, I'm going to go back to the very first time I learned this lesson. I came up with this little life sentence thing way back in college, which was many moons ago, okay? So it was my sophomore year, and I remember writing out a sentence. This was the sentence that young 20-year-old Tim Elmore wanted to be remembered by. And here's the sentence I put within the 3 lines. I want to influence the influencers. That was a big thought for a 20-year-old at the time. I want to influence the influencers. I wrote it down on a piece of paper. We didn't have any computers. And I just put it in my back pocket, and I carried it around with me every day. I want to influence the influencers. Well, little did I know that today I'd be doing that by training leaders. I do leadership training as a calling. And I think that's influencing the influencers. But you know what I discovered? I think at every life station you're in, he gives you a way to live it out for that life station. In your 20s, in your 30s, in your 40s, in your 50s. I'm now in my 60s. But I think in my 20s, God used me at the time to fulfill that sentence in a way that was appropriate. So here's what happened. I was a full-time college student, and I worked 2 other jobs. One was a fast food joint, and one was a part-time youth pastor. So one Sunday night, I came back from the church. We just had a youth group meeting. And I put my keys down on the dresser and my wallet, and I turned on the TV just to kind of decompress. And on the TV that particular night was an episode of 2020. Have you all heard of 2020? I think it's been on since Deuteronomy, maybe. It's been around many, many, many years. So Barbara Walters and Hugh Downs were on the TV, and that night they happened to be interviewing all the band members of the heavy metal band Kiss. You remember Kiss? Okay, they're still around. Gene Simmons and Ace Frehley, Paul Stanley, and Peter Criss. All 4 members. Well, they were in the height of their glory. This was, well, as I mentioned, this was many years ago. But they're being interviewed that night, and they're bragging about all the money they're making, all the T-shirts they're selling, all the women they had in their life. And as I'm watching, I'm thinking, dadgummit, the kids in my youth group are watching this and thinking this is cool. So I thought, oh, this is making me mad here. You know, and I'm 20 years old, so I'm innocent and naive. But I had to turn off the TV. I walked outside, and I started roaming around the dorm, the residence hall. And as I'm roaming around, I start praying, God, somebody ought to do something about that. By the way, that is a dangerous prayer to pray. You do know that, don't you? Somebody ought to do something, because all of a sudden you start feeling or sensing God himself poking you, saying, what about you, you know? So I finally realized that I was supposed to do something. So I thought, well, I can pray for Kiss, or I could have a parent meeting on the evils of rock music or something like that. But that night, I felt I was being prompted that I needed to go find KISS and talk to them about their spiritual lives. I know it sounds zany, but it sounds zany when you remember who KISS is. Do you remember these guys? Here they are, okay? They wore makeup in all their concerts, which they scrubbed off 250 times a year, if not more. And so here's Gene Simmons. He had surgery on his tongue so it could come out longer like a snake. Peter Criss, Paul Stanley, you get the deal. So I make a deal with God. I make deals with God, and I never do well. But here's what I did. All right, I said, all right, God, I will go and share you with KISS if I'm ever in the same town at the same time they are. I figured that was a safe bet because, I'm in Tulsa. Well, you won't believe this, but the very next semester, one of my friends, Rob, on the dorm floor comes over and says, hey, did you hear KISS was coming to town? I said, oh no. And he said, what are you thinking about? What do you mean? And I said, Bob, I made a deal with God. I've got it, But so the bottom line, I know I'm taking long with this, but it was a hilarious adventure. So I found out the night of the concert, I found out what hotel they were staying in because I went down to the Assembly Center and the guy told me they were staying at the Camelot Inn. So I go to the Camelot Inn the night of the concert. I've got a sport coat on. I've got little Bibles and tracts, those little literature, I'm all lined up, ready to go. So I go to the front desk clerk and I said, excuse me. I said, could I have Gene Simmons' room, please? Like they're going to give it to me. But she goes, well, we're not permitted to give that information out, but they have checked in. I thought, good. At least she confirmed they're here at this hotel. So I start roaming around the lobby of this hotel. It's a big one. And I start thinking to myself, where would I be if I was a celebrity in this hotel? And I thought to myself, I know where it is. It's the presidential suite, up at the very top of the hotel. So I ride the elevator all the way up to the top floor. I think it was floor 7. Walk down the hallway. I see the presidential suite and the door's open. Ooh, this is awesome, So I walk in the door. I wonder if they're there. They're not there, but the maids are in there making up the bed, fluffing the pillows, putting the chocolates down on the bed. So I kind of play dumb and I say, wow, this is a nice room. I said, I bet all the celebrities stay in this room when they come to town, don't they? Well, one of the maids was so sweet. She looks up and she goes, yes. She said, all the celebrities always stay in this room. But she said, it's a funny thing. KISS is in town tonight and they're not in this room at all. They're right downstairs at room 628. So I thought, thank you very much. And I run out of the room. Well, I go down the floor to the 6th floor, to room 628. I knock on the door. Nobody's there. So I thought, all right, I'm just going to hang around the 6th floor until they show up. That was my plan. Simple man, simple plan. Well, I wait for a couple of hours until I'm roaming. It's kind of a tripod floor thing. It was a very funky hotel. I'm walking around all the different hallways to see if they're going to sneak up some way. And I finally look down in front of room 628 and I've missed them because there's a man standing in front of the door. He's not one of the band members, but he's the man they have hired to, guard them. And they have hired the right man, okay? He's tall this way and he's tall this way, all right? So he's just hanging out, literally, in front of the door. So I decide, well, I got to go through him to get to them. So I walk up to this big man. I reach up to shake hands, I look him right in the kneecap, and I said, sir, my name is Tim Elmore. I'm a college student here in town. I'm a part-time youth pastor. I said, would you mind if I just take a few minutes and talk to Gene Simmons, Ace Frehley, Paul Stanley, and Peter Criss, just for a moment? Well, this guy kind of grunts, and he says, it's my job to keep people like you awake. And I said, I know, sir, and I know you could do a fine job of that right now, but if you won't let me talk to them, could I give you something? And I had pulled out some stuff I had written. It was like a little Hallmark card, but I drew a picture of KISS on the front, and I just wrote out, here's how you build a relationship with Jesus. So I handed it to him, and this was when the magic happened. He looks down at this card, and he can tell I'm not a groupie, I'm not a weirdo or whatever. I want to talk to him about, their spiritual lives. And so he goes, wow, this is pretty serious, isn't it? I said, yes, sir, it's very serious to me. And he said, well, I'm not supposed to tell anybody this, but every night after their concerts, they always go downstairs to the bar for a little nightcap about 2 a.m. If you want to join us at 2 a.m., I'm going to let you talk to him as long as you want to. I mean, evidently, I had favor with this guy. So I said, thank you very much. And I ran down the hall before he could change his mind. Well, it was midnight at that point, so I had 2 hours to wait. 2 more hours to wait. And I got to tell you, during those 2 hours, I almost walked out. And you know how it is. You feel like you're doing something that's way bigger than you. You don't belong in this place. Who the heck do you think you are? And I was picturing Gene Simmons' tongue coming out and wrapping around my neck and throwing me across the room. I was going to get beat up. The bouncer's going to beat me up. All the worst things came to my mind. And really, truly, I remember almost walking out 2 or 3 times. Except that I had that little sentence in my back pocket. And I remember pulling it out and just reading it. He influenced, or I want to influence the influencers. I thought at 20 years old, this is all I got. This is my best chance. I'm in this situation. All I got to do is just stick around. That was my ambition, just stick around. So I did for 2 more hours. And at 2 o'clock on the dot, the elevator doors open, and here they come. The bouncer walks out first. I kind of wave to him. Hey, we've met. We're friends. 3 women come out that they've had in the room with them that night. And then 4 of the ugliest men I've ever seen in all my life. I'm serious. They had their makeup scrubbed off so it looked like they had bumps and acne all over their face. They saunter into the bar. I follow them in. So now I look inside the bar. Listen, there's nobody else there. There's 4 members of KISS, 3 women, the bouncer, and Pat Boone. Here I am, So I walk up to the bouncer. I said, could I talk to him now? He said, yeah, go. So now he's kind of my bouncer, he's telling me go. So I go over to them, and to make a long story short, they were sitting in a circle, and they were not high, they were not wasted, they weren't drunk, they were just talking. And I said, hey, excuse me, I'm sorry to interrupt, but good concert tonight. I thought I ought to start with that. Good concert tonight. And then I said, could I ask you guys a question? They go, yeah, sure. And I said, do you ever think about your influence on kids? He was quiet for a second, and then one of them chimed in, yeah, we're selling all t-shirts. It's great. I said, no, not the t-shirts. I said, your lyrics. I said, I know they're amazing and you fill concert halls, but do you ever think about what you're saying and how it might affect the narrative of middle schoolers? And that started an incredible conversation about influence and about God. In fact, what's really cool is as I'm talking and they're talking back, one of the guys looks up and says, oh, are you the one that wrote that stuff that we got in the room? I thought, this is incredible. They're up in the room with 3 women reading my tracks. This is awesome. But I said, yeah, absolutely. I think Jesus is real. I believe he's coming back. And we started talking about this. We talked for 15 to 20 minutes until I finally thought I better not wear out my welcome. So I said, would you guys mind if I just pray with you real quick? They go, sure. They bowed their heads. Hair flowed down as they bowed their heads. And we prayed together. And then I walked away. And I have prayed for that set of 4 men ever since that time. The cool thing is, about a year and a half later, I remember hearing on the news that Peter Criss, one of their band members, had quit the group. He had come to faith and he thought, I don't want to do this anymore. In the year 2000, I know that's a long time ago, but you might remember KISS did the closing concert at the Olympics that year in Salt Lake City. The photographer called me from Salt Lake City. She had heard me tell this story and she goes, you ought to know this. I've heard you tell your story. She goes, did you know KISS, before they do their concert, they join hands and they pray before their concert. And they give 10% of what they make to charities now. Now, I know that doesn't mean they're turning into Billy Graham, but I'd like to think they're on the right road. And that maybe, just maybe, God used a simple 20-year-old college kid and maybe 1,000 other people at the time to just poke a little bit at what they really, really live by. So that opened up a door for me to do that for the next several years. In fact, my sophomore, junior, and senior year, I ended up getting to talk to probably a dozen other bands and musicians, and it was awesome. But I share this with you just because of this point. I'm a very ordinary person, and I was way more ordinary at 20 than I am now. But I just believe God's looking for an Esther who's 14 or a Tim who's 20, who just willing and wacko enough to think, let's go do this. Let's not just sit around and play it safe. I love what Winston Churchill said. He said, there comes a special moment in everyone's life, a moment for which that person is born. That special opportunity, when he seizes it, will fulfill his mission, a mission for which he's uniquely qualified. And in that moment, he finds greatness. It is his finest hour. I believe there are moments in our life, moments plural, but we got to look for them. And when we meet them, we've got to be ready for them. So I'm saying to you, is there a sentence that you could even choose now that will determine what's on your tombstone? Because you lived it Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. You don't have to live by accident. You can live by faith. And that's what this whole series is about, living by faith. But the best way I know I can do it is to figure out who God's made me to be, who he is, and then give myself a target to hit. Here's the sentence. I've found mine. Now I'm going to close with a really quick story, but it's about someone you know. My son Jonathan is very near and dear to my heart. He's my only son. I like to say you're my only begotten son, but that's too biblical here. But when both of my kids turned 12, I took them on a trip, a daddy-daughter trip and a daddy-son trip, and I let them choose where they wanted to go. Well, Jonathan, at 12 years old, chose Minneapolis, Minnesota. Sounds kind of random, doesn't it? But the reason he did is that at 12 years old, he knew that the Mall of America was up there with Camp Snoopy and the roller coaster inside the mall, and he wanted to ride on that. And he wanted to get something fun at the mall. And then, of course, there was a production up there. He loves theater, and he wanted to see that show that he knew the director. So Dad and son flew up to Minneapolis, and we took Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and we had a blast. Rode on roller coasters, ate junk food, did stuff we never told Mom about. Okay, can I say that? But on Monday, Jonathan knew that this was not going to be roller coaster time anymore. We were going to have a heart-to-heart father-son talk. And he was kind of nervous. Dad, what are we going to talk about? Jonathan, just relax. So on Monday, we got in our rental car. We drove up to one of the 10,000 lakes up in the Minneapolis area. And I parked the car in a place right next to the lake, but it was a little parking lot, a small parking lot. And I stopped the car and I looked at my son, who was in the passenger seat, and I said, Jonathan, I want to trade places with you right now. He said, Dad, what do you mean? I said, I want to get out of the car, go around to the passenger side. I want you to sit behind this wheel, and I want you to drive this car. Now remember, he's 12 years old, not 16. So the first thing he says is, Dad, that's illegal. That is illegal. That's illegal. So I said, I know, Jonathan, but we're not going to go out on the main road. We're just going to be right here in this parking lot, but I want to see if you can handle this big multiple-ton machine. I think you can. Next thing he said, Dad, Mom will not like this. Mom will not like this. I said, Jonathan, she doesn't need to know. So I finally talk him into it. We trade places, and I'll never forget my son barely seeing above the windshield, but he can see above the dashboard. I explain the ignition and the brake and the accelerator and the gear shift. And after a few instructions, he gets it, because kids learn just in time, not just in case, right? So he eventually turns the car on and he backs it up. Well, I'm telling you, within 2 minutes, he's feeling very much like a man. You know, he's doing everything he's seen me do, you know, that sort of thing. He's backing up, parallel parking, diagonal parking, screeching to a halt, you know. He drives it for several minutes until I finally said, all right, stop. We trade places again. It was at this point that I said, Jonathan, I want to talk to you, and I want you to, this is going to feel really cheesy, but would you just go with me on this? I got a question. I said, how did you feel when you first got behind the wheel of this car? He said, Dad, I panicked. I didn't think I could do it. I said, what'd you just show me? He said, I guess I showed you I could do it. I said, Jonathan, this is exactly how you're going to feel becoming a man. You're going to feel like you can't do it. You're going to feel like the only one that doesn't understand what you're supposed to do. I said, none of us do, Jonathan, none of us do. But I said, you just showed me it was in you to drive this big machine. And then we began to talk about how over the next several years, he would be becoming a man, ready or not. I talked about how his view of girls would be changing, how his body would be changing, how his view of his parents would be changing. But it opened up an incredible conversation about his life. And then I said one more thing. I said, Jonathan, before we leave, what else did you know about this situation? Well, it took him a few minutes to get this one, but he said, well, Dad, I guess I knew you were right there next to me if something went wrong. And I said, exactly. And in life, now, Jonathan, it's going to sound cheesy, but listen to me. In life, your Heavenly Father is right there. He's never any further away than right there. Well, it was at that point that I want to make the point to you. I drove over 5 minutes away because I found there was an old graveyard, one of those old 19th century graveyards, about 5 minutes away. And this time we parked, got out of the car, and I said, Jonathan, I want you to look at these tombstones. In fact, let's both just walk around the graveyard in utter silence, no talking for the next 10 minutes. Let's just read the epitaphs on the gravestones. We did. It was weird, but it was daylight, so it wasn't funky, okay? But after it was over, he and I sat down on the curb, and I got to tell you, I had the greatest conversation I've ever had with a 12-year-old kid. But it was with my own son, who began to describe, this is the sentence I want to be said about me. And so I leave you with this. If you choose your sentence now, you can determine what they say at that funeral one day. You can determine more proactively and intentionally what your life is going to look like, living by faith and knowing what you're living for. Let me pray with you. Father, I'm asking you just to help us make sense of what our sentence should be. And I pray you'd help us to live by faith in advance of that day we leave this earth. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.